Good morning, everybody. You know, you get up on a Sunday morning and you go to church and you think you know what you're going to get, right? They don't teach you this in seminary. There's a full crew doing a canoe down here. We've got people hurdling. There was this woman that did a perfect griddy in the first service over here, and I wanted to stop because I realized anything that was going to happen to that was anticlimactic. Well, we hope you got some food. We hope you got some drinks. Where's the giant foam hat? I'm just glad it's not right in the middle. At this point, we've got an entire student section. I thought for sure somebody would be shirtless with body paint. Feel like we're trending in the right direction. If you're online, I wish you could see this. I wish you could. So I'm glad you're here. We are actually going to pick back up in a series that we started last week. It's called Don't Get It Twisted. And we're looking at some biblical advice for love, sex, singleness, and dating. Listen, there are a lot of areas in life where we can potentially get it twisted. And one of those areas is relationships. You can get it twisted when it comes to relationships, not just any relationship. I'm talking about romantic relationships. Sometimes those most important people in our lives create challenges. Those worlds get messy and complicated. They're emotionally charged, sometimes downright confusing. And there are people everywhere looking for answers, and maybe you're one of them. Maybe you're looking for answers today, but what you often get is conflicting information from different sources and different people and from culture about how to navigate all things romance. And so during these weeks, we're exploring some advice. It's what we're doing. We believe that God has some great advice for us. Believe that God has some important insights for us that can help us navigate some pretty complicated issues. And that's why we're tackling these 4 relational subjects. We're talking about love and sex and singleness and dating. And I do realize we're covering a range of subjects because a lot of you come into the room in different relational situations. Some of you sit here today and you're not married, you're single, and maybe you're happily single. Some of you are maybe unhappily single. Some of you are happily married. There's probably some of you that are unhappily married. You may be divorced at this point, widowed at this point, remarried at this point. You may be in love, trying to find love. Maybe you've sworn off love forever. Listen, wherever you are right now in your relationship journey, our hope is to jump into whatever conversation you're having right in the middle of that and afford you, hopefully, something helpful for you or for someone you care about. Because we don't want you to get it twisted in these important areas. And certainly when it comes to today's subject, we can't afford to get it twisted when it comes to sex. So today is all about sex. It's about sexual intimacy today. And I realize when you walk in the room, this is not a neutral subject. All of you come in here with some preconceived notion about this. Some of you right now, I have no doubt, you're starting to feel a little nervous. You have a church history, maybe you were brought up in a certain way, and you cannot believe that we're going to sit here and talk about sex in church all morning. In fact, you're a little worried that guy on stage has said the word sex like 7 times, like already this morning, and you don't sense it slowing down either. Some of you just showed up and you're like, I don't know, I got a corn dog, I got some donut holes, I got a cup of coffee, and now we're talking about sex. This may be the best church ever. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We try. Yet in all seriousness, there is a whole other group of you, maybe lots of you, who don't know how you feel about this just yet, and here's why. Because this subject is actually a sore spot for you in some way. Listen, this is not a subject that some people look forward to addressing because many times sexual intimacy can be a major challenge for individuals, and it becomes a big challenge for couples in relationships. And we're going to talk more about that later today. But no matter how you're feeling about the topic, it is a critical subject. It is so important, and that is why we've got to talk about it. But even as I say that, I will acknowledge this, that sometimes sex can be difficult to talk about. It can be difficult to talk about. It is sensitive. It is a subject that feels very personal. It is a subject that feels intensely private. And not only that, sex sometimes is just awkward. It's just an awkward and uncomfortable thing to talk about. I do still remember back all the way to grade school. In elementary school, we had a sex ed seminar at our school, and it was boys and girls, and we sat in the same classroom, and we started hearing words that we couldn't unhear. And we started seeing pictures we couldn't unsee. And all of us together literally are staring at the floor, hoping against hope. Gosh, I hope they don't call on one of us to answer a question in the middle of the seminar. Some of you have had that awkward experience of sitting with a parent. It might have been a mom or a dad or a grandparent or somebody, and they attempted to have the talk with you. I mean, the very fact that we know it as the talk, right? mean, was it Voldemort? Like, you just don't say it out loud. Like, you can't say it out loud, and there's birds and there's bees, and you don't know what happened, but you were just glad it was over. They were glad it was over. Now the joke's on you because you're a parent, and you realize you're going to have that talk at some point with your kids. Listen, it is an awkward and uncomfortable thing to do. If it helps you feel any better, I'm being recorded right now. My mom is going to watch this later. So we're all in this together. We're all in this together. Sex is difficult to talk about. So here's what happens. Because it's difficult to talk about, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. And because we don't talk about it, there are many people and many couples that walk into relationships unprepared in this important area. They're unprepared. In fact, I think actually probably a better way to say it is not unprepared as much as couples are often misprepared when it comes to sex. We're misprepared. Because while we may not always be having these open, I call them healthy dialogues about sex, we are being informed about it every day. Someone is talking about it to all of us. Culture talks about sex every day. Media speaks to us and informs us about intimacy every day. Movies talk about sex every day. Music does. Social media does. Advertisements do. Pornography certainly does, whether it's blatant or whether it's subtle. Every day when we walk around our world, our views and our beliefs and our hopes and our expectations about sex are being crafted, and they're being shaped moment by moment, minute by minute. And what do we see every day? Oftentimes, here's what we see every day. Example after example of sexually satisfied people. Everybody, everywhere, apparently, is having fun, creative, romantic, regular, spontaneous, sexually charged encounters anywhere and everywhere. And we carry those images, those pictures, those ideas into our relationships. We carry them into marriage. And we find ourselves thinking, listen, this is all going to be great. This is all just easy. This all just works. But the reality is, it doesn't always just work, does it? It's because we're misprepared. Many times we've been uninformed about certain things around this critical subject. And sometimes we run into disconnects in our relationships. We run into disconnects in our marriages, and it surprises us. We walk in thinking satisfaction. That's the word we're looking for. But we walk out feeling not that. We feel frustration. And some of you, maybe you feel disappointment or hurt or anger or isolation, loneliness. And around this subject, there's this feeling of resentment. And that's why I say this subject as a whole can be a very personal challenge for many people. And if you sit in the room today and you're challenged in this area, you are not alone. When it comes to sexual intimacy, it is so easy for us to get it twisted. And that's why from time to time, again, we could all use some advice. We can use some reminders. And we're talking about this subject today for one reason, because I really do believe that God has some great advice for us when it comes to sex. He has some important things that we need to hear. And I realize, again, I look out in a room this big, and there are many people tuning in online right now. I recognize this. You may not be used to taking God's advice on things, or if you are, maybe you don't believe that God would practically speak to something like this in your life, in your world. So maybe you're not inclined to naturally lean into what he would say around sexual intimacy. But I would encourage you today, this is my encouragement today, no matter where you stand in your faith today, lean in. Because not only does God have some advice, I think he has good news for you. No matter where you sit today, God has some good news for us. God has an amazing intention for us when it comes to sex and intimacy. God has a great and incredible purpose for sex. And all of us would do ourselves a disservice to not at least consider what God would want for us in this important area. And so if you sit here today, you may be young and you may be looking forward to a relationship someday. You may be unmarried in today's culture and you're trying to navigate this portion of your life, or you're married and you're trying to live your best married life ever. Man, dial in. God has some things he wants us to understand. God never wants us to be uninformed. He doesn't want us to be misinformed around these important things. And so we're going to start by saying this today. Here's kind of the big idea that I think God would have for us today. That God designed sex. He designed sex to be a powerful and pleasurable point of connection within a marriage. And so before you think about all that, we're going to explore each part of this statement a bit more closely here in the next few minutes. God has a very positive, very healthy view of sexual intimacy. It starts here. Sex, I believe, is primarily a point of connection that God has designed for two individuals. We look back at the beginning pages of the Bible. In fact, you look at the very, very beginning in the book of Genesis, we see this creation account, and we read these words. It says that a man leaves his father and mother and is united. United. That word united means joined. The man leaves his father and mother, he's united, he is joined to his wife, and they become one flesh. One flesh, bonded, united into one. And what he's really speaking of here is this uniting and this bonding is about sexual union. That's what's being spoken of. And as a result of the sexual union for this man and this woman, we're told that they become one flesh. There's a oneness component to something that happens through sexual intimacy. It's an intense form of intimacy. We get kind of a fuller picture as we go to Genesis 4. It says that Adam knew his wife Eve. He knew his wife. You could read this in a different translation. It would say that Adam laid with his wife Eve, or Adam was intimate with his wife. That's what that means. And the actual word in Hebrew, as you translate it out, it's actually this word right here. It is that word intercourse. In other words, Adam had intercourse with his wife. He knew her. He knew her. And what that really means is this. It says he had thorough, exhaustive knowledge, total sharing in every area of life. It feels like a sexual term, but it's a term of connection. They knew each other. There was a deep intimacy because they were bonded in that way. And it's important you understand this. Understand, Adam and Eve, they didn't just feel connected. They actually were connected. They were joined. See, when the Bible talks about this nature of sexual union, it's not a feeling. It's not just infatuation. It's not romance. It's not having the warm fuzzies. One flesh connection is something real. It's not just something you feel. Through a sexual union, you actually become connected with another person in a very real, very tangible, it feels almost like a mysterious, spiritual kind of way. In fact, we see the same thing. If you were to turn to the New Testament and you see the Apostle Paul is one of the great writers of the New Testament. He writes letters to churches. He writes a particular letter to the church in Corinth. And he says to the church in Corinth, listen, I want you to listen up. It had become a very progressive city, very promiscuous city, and they had prostitutes that were actually connected to some of the temple worship in Corinth. And there were people that were saying, hey, I want to follow Jesus, but they were connecting with these prostitutes. And Paul gave them a warning. He said, hey, don't connect with those prostitutes the way other people are doing. But look what he says. He says, this is why. Do you not know that he who unites himself, there's that word again, who bonds himself with a prostitute is what? Immoral? It's not the word he uses. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is wrong? He doesn't use that word either. He says, no, when you unite yourself with a prostitute, you're one with her. You are one with her in body. It's not a feeling. He's saying, don't kid yourself. This does something. It bonds two people together, and then he references back to God's original design. He says the two, even if it's you and a prostitute, you become one flesh. Something happens. Listen, Paul is saying to that church what he would say to us today. He would say this: there is actually no such thing as casual sex. There's no such thing as casual sex. At times it may look casual. At times it may even feel casual, but it's not, because it does something. Sex actually does something. And we cannot just compartmentalize sex into kind of a simple, inconsequential physical act. It is so much more powerful than that. It joins two people together. Sex is about connection, and it is a powerful, real connection. It is a real, powerful point of connection within a marriage. Within a marriage. I'm going to pause right there because I know I've lost some of you probably in that. I keep saying this. Within a marriage. Let me make a comment about that. Listen, when we understand God's design for sex, in other words, when we know what sex really does, when we see how powerful sex really is, I think we can better understand why God encourages us, desires us to practice sex within the safety of a lifelong marriage. I'll say it this way. Physical intimacy is designed by God to be expressed within a marriage, not because sex is wrong, because it's that powerful. And so if you're in the room today and you're not married, again, you may be a student, you may be unmarried, maybe you're dating right now, you may even be engaged. I will say this to you: reserving sex for marriage. Reserving sex for marriage. It's not God's way of stifling you. God is not doing that to repress you. He's not doing that to punish you. He's not saying that to control you. God allows for that because he wants to protect us. He's not stifling you. He's trying to protect you. God wants us to protect and guard our body. Why? Because he knows that sexual union is so powerful. It deeply affects the mind and the heart. I would say it this way. Sex is a life-uniting act. That's how powerful it is. And it needs to be guarded by a life-uniting intent. It's the context of marriage. And so reserving sex, we don't talk about this often, but reserving sex for marriage, it's not punitive. It's not prudish. It's protective. It's for the good of your own heart. When you connect with someone in a sexually premature way, you can pay the price. And some people pay the price for the long haul. They pay the price for the long haul. Some of the most relational, painful breakups, some of the most lasting emotional, relational baggage gets carried through life because it's the product of trying to separate out two people who have been bonded together in a way that they don't fully even understand. And they didn't commit to a lifelong covenant relationship. Sex is something that is so amazing. It needs to be protected. We need to guard our bodies because it's powerful. And Scripture tells us that. It is a powerful, powerful point of connection in a marriage. But I'll say this, that's kind of half the puzzle. Here's the other part. God designed sex to be a pleasurable point of connection. Some of you just woke back up. Welcome. Enough with the Hebrew words, right? Let's get to some good stuff. And we're about to get to the good stuff. Listen, God designed sex to be a source of pleasure in a relationship, in a marriage. So what it means is this: God grants us freedom. God grants us freedom to fully and physically enjoy our spouse. There's a man named Solomon. Solomon was gifted with great wisdom. He wrote a bunch of the Old Testament wisdom literature, and he tells us this in Proverbs 5. He says, "Let your wife be a fountain of blessing for you. Let her body satisfy you always." And I'll tell you this word body, I actually kind of edited it out because I knew we were going to try to be PG-13, but you get the right text in there. I'm telling you what, it doesn't say body. It says something different. And it says, let that satisfy you always. Do you know what always means? You do, always, all the time. Like, keep letting it satisfy you. He says, may you always be captivated, intoxicated, exhilarated by her love. Solomon puts into words God's desire for us to be able to seek pleasure through sexual intimacy. Solomon penned an entire other work called Song of Solomon in the Old Testament. It speaks so openly about sexual pleasure. In fact, he writes kind of an explicit detail of what it's like to be not just emotionally, but physically captivated by someone else. You can go there and read it. He paints this picture. He talks about gazelles and pomegranates and mountains of myrrh and spiced valleys, gardens and lilies. Like, it's poetry, right? It's a little secret. He's not that excited about fruit and topography and animals on the open plain. But this imagery, it's the bride and the groom. They describe each other in these glowing terms, their physical bodies, because they're experiencing full and unmitigated pleasure in physical activity. And I'm not trying to make this more graphic than it is. It's the reality of this, though, that God speaks openly about the joy and pleasure of sex and sexual intimacy. We made it clear throughout Scripture. We have freedom to enjoy this amazing sexual intimacy that God has designed. Listen, sex is not unspiritual. Contrary to some popular beliefs, sex is actually not unspiritual. It's not something that we need to be embarrassed about. It is not something that we want to be ashamed of because we have this freedom. Listen, it's woven into God's good creation. He made people in the image of God, and part of that image is to have this image as a sexual being. We can embrace that. We can be thankful for that. And we get to enjoy that. And some of you need to hear this. Some of you need to be reminded that God has actually hardwired us to have sexual desire. That is a real thing. And some of you have been taught, again, maybe by parents, maybe even in goodwill, maybe you've had churches do this to you, but they've been taught and you've been said, sex is unspiritual. It's their preventative way maybe to try to protect you. Sex is unspiritual or sex is undecent. Some of you have been taught from a very early age, you absolutely cannot have sex outside of marriage. Why? Because sex is dirty and sex is ugly and it is perverted and it's filthy. Not to protect you, but they say that to shame you. And so if you've been taught over time that sex is unspiritual, you may carry that weight of sexual shame. You may carry that with you. And if you do, there's a good chance that'll have a ripple effect into your relationship. It may have a ripple effect into your marriage. Listen, if you walked into marriage right now and you were taught that sex was unspiritual, there's a chance that maybe you're more restrained and more inhibited than you would like to be with your spouse. There's a chance that you might feel ashamed of sexual desires when they emerge or when you act on those, and maybe you won't experience the joy and the freedom that God would allow for us and what God would want for you. And I see couples struggle with this. They want to live out a Jesus-centered marriage, but they're restricted. They really are. They're restricted and held back because one or both are holding on to this corrupted view of sexual intimacy. And we look back again to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, as he talks to the church, and he says, yeah, when it comes to sexual immorality, I'm going to encourage you, abstain, protect yourself, protect your heart and your mind. But to the married couples, again, he says, don't think that way. He said, the husband fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. He's saying universally now, husbands, wives, you've got this freedom. He says the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but he yields it to her husband. And in the same way, the husband, he doesn't have authority over his own body, but he yields it to his wife. Again, it's one to the other. Neither side being dominant, both sides being bonded together in this relationship. And he says, don't deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. And if you stop and you read that, just read that text on face value in a literal way, it will shock you as God speaks to the freedom and the pleasure that can be found in the context of marriage. So sex in marriage is not something you have to do. It's something you get to do. And it's not just something we get to do, it's actually something we get to enjoy. Sex in our marriage can be fun and uninhibited and unrestrained and passionate and creative, life-giving. It is God-honoring. And that may be the best thing you've heard in church in 20 years. Listen, we can't get it twisted. God designed sex to be powerful. It is powerful, but it's also a pleasurable point of connection within that context of marriage. Listen, people want to experience deep, connected intimacy. And it can happen through sexual union. That's what people are looking for. But that's why we need to consider God's advice around this critical subject. That's why we need to carefully consider or maybe reconsider what God would say about it. Because we know it's challenging. I said it earlier on, I'll say it again. We face challenges when it comes to considering God's advice about sex and about sexual intimacy. Some of you, maybe you're challenged even right now just reading this, and maybe you're like, I'm not so sure I agree with all of that. I understand. Some of you are challenged because as much as you may see the idealism in this, maybe you don't see others experiencing this. Maybe you've never had someone share this with you and experience it and be able to share that with you. But otherwise, some of you, you're just not experiencing it in your own relationship. That's the challenge for you. You're sitting in your relationship right now. You're sitting in your marriage right now, and you're saying, boy, this sounds great, but I don't experience this. The truth is, I said, it is a challenge for many couples. There are so many roadblocks, so many things that can stand in the way of couples who are trying to walk with Jesus and walk out sexual intimacy that we can't be ignorant of those. Some people, you walk into your marriage, maybe you've got some residue from the past that is still not dealt with, previous relationships. Maybe you've had poor or harmful moments and experiences, maybe even trauma. Some of you just flat out are dealing with some health challenges. Maybe you've got hormonal changes. Some of you struggle with insecurity, body image issues. There's different ideas among couples about what's appropriate or inappropriate. There's just different interest levels. When it comes to sex, that's not even the practical stuff, like the fact that we've got busy calendars and demands of the work world and stress and anxiety and financial stuff and lack of sleep. Some of you have kids. You know, kids do nothing to help your sex life. That's just an axiom in life right there. It's a challenge for so many people for so many reasons. And so if you feel disconnected in your relationship, again, you're not alone. You're not alone, but you're not without hope. Because God would want this. He would want this for you. God would want you to experience all that he wants for you in this area. And so as we kind of close up today, I'm going to encourage you something. Don't discount this. No matter where you sit today, even in your experience, like your past experience, don't let your background, don't let even the current state of your relationship stop you from chasing after this. Don't let your faith journey stop you from at least considering what this might look like for you in your relationships. Don't give up. This area is way too important. It is way too important. And we need to start taking steps in the right direction. It starts today with us having an open conversation about it. But as we do wrap up today, I want to give you some practical handles. I've kind of talked about like high level stuff, some principles and some ideals, but I want to give you a starting point. Like, where would we start to make some ground in this critical area? And again, I am sort of talking to married couples. I know that, but I do want the rest of you to tune in, because there may be some things you take from this, even in the current relationship you're in. If you want to grow closer when it comes to sexual intimacy, you've got to start here. Talk about sex. I said at the onset, that's one of the biggest challenges, that we don't often talk about it. And if you want to improve your sex life, you've got to talk about sex, not just in the bedroom, but outside the bedroom. Make it a regular part of your conversations. I said a lot of people are unprepared and misprepared and disconnected when it comes to this subject. And maybe you've never had that chance to talk specifically about your relationship with your partner. In other words, hey, what is our family background? What did we bring into this? What are the experiences we've had? What are the different perspectives we might have? Maybe you've never talked about your sexual expectations or your assumptions together. You need to talk about those expectations. You need to talk about some of those assumptions. Maybe you've never talked about your desires or your preferences or your likes or your dislikes or your hopes or your wants or your needs. And it can be hard to do. But you need to start the conversation. Talk about it. Listen, we talk about so many areas of our marriages. We talk about finances. We talk about how to parent our kids together. We talk about work worlds. We talk about schedules. We talk about all these things. What if sexual intimacy was actually a subject that was important as the rest of those, and we put it on the table? And while it's hard at the beginning, if you turn it into a regular conversation, it actually starts to dissolve the taboo nature of it for you. Sometimes the hardest part is just getting started. Maybe you've never done it before. Maybe you've never talked about that in your relationship. Here's a word of encouragement. Don't be haphazard about it. Like, don't start at that door, like in the lobby. Don't do it here. Please. Be thoughtful and intentional, right? Be thoughtful and intentional. What gives you as a couple the best chance to have a healthy, open dialogue about this? What does it look like? Find the right time. Find the right place. And when I say the right time, I mean a time when you're not hurried. Find the right place, a place that is private and conducive to the conversation. Don't start talking about sex when the kids are running around. Don't do it 5 minutes before you leave for work. Don't do it when you're both on your phones or doing something on the side. Don't do it late at night when you're tired or when you're frustrated, right? Be intentional. Think about when is the right season for you to do this. Maybe you have to schedule it, as weird as that sounds. If you've got a date night coming up or something like that, put it out there and say, hey, I'd love to have a conversation, just to start the conversation around this topic. We've never done it before. I want to do it. Let's do it well. Start the conversation. And if nothing else, you can blame me. I've given you grounds to do it today. You can say that guy on stage said we're supposed to talk about it, so I will take the hit for that. Start talking about sex in your relationship. Here's another starting point. Find a helpful resource. Here's why I say this. A helpful resource. If you do number 2, it will actually help you do number 1. So many times we don't talk about sex in our relationships because maybe we don't know how to start the conversation. We don't know what the conversation should look like. Maybe you don't have context and words to use. That's where it's helpful to find an outsourced resource. It can give you some tracks to run on. It becomes a conversation starter for you. And maybe you don't know this, but there are actually a lot of great resources out there. There are some amazing principled things, practical resources, and they will help you employ godly principles for sexual intimacy in your relationship. One simple starting point is to look for a book. There are books all over written on this subject, great authors. And if you don't know where to look, I will help you find one. I would happily make suggestions. But you can find a book, and you can find balanced books. Some books speak directly to men, some directly to women. Many speak directly to both partners in that relationship. Again, they cover all manner of subjects. And what you do is you get a book, and you can use it, just read one chapter together and discuss it. That way you don't have to use the words, they're using the words. You read it and say, hey, what do you think about that? Hey, have you ever thought about that? And it prompts conversation. At least it's a starting point to get you rolling down the track. You might not be a reader, I understand that. Maybe you don't like reading books. There are online resources all over the place. You can actually find, again, some great online resources. One group, and there's just one, it's called One Extraordinary Marriage. If you Google One Extraordinary Marriage, you'll find them. They're one I like of many. They have a podcast every week, and they talk about all manners of intimacy, but they talk very openly about sexual intimacy from a Christian perspective. But they have podcasts. They'll send you free emails. You can get, writing on that. You can find people just like them, couples, organizations, and they'll send you things for free. all over the place. You can buy more if you want. You could literally build an entire seminar in your house if you wanted to with what you can find online through these resources. We got to talk about sex, and sometimes finding that resource is the next step you need to take to get you pointed in the right direction. But I'll finish by saying this. If you really want to start well, you need to be committed to doing your part. You need to be committed to doing your part. Because if you really do want to build a healthier sex life, it starts with you. Listen, it is easy to point the finger. It is easy to lay blame and put the burden to improve things on that other person. But be prepared to work on you. Do that hard thing of looking in the mirror and saying, what is my part in this? In other words, what are my beliefs? What are my desires? How am I exercising those? What are the actions I'm taking or the inactions I'm not taking, right, that affect my spouse, that affect sexual intimacy? Do your own homework so that when you come into that conversation, you're not coming with a desire to manipulate. You're not coming with a desire to coerce. You're not coming with a pre-designed outcome that you want to try to manage. You've got to be defensive, or you want to be non-defensive, right? Humble, willing to listen, willing to learn. Ultimately, the goal is to serve your partner in this area and see where God can take you and grow and be strengthened. So do your part. If you want to build a better sex life, you've got to start. You've got to start. If you keep doing the same thing, you're going to keep getting the same results. You've got to start somewhere. Talk about it, maybe find a resource, and make sure you do your part. And listen, if all else fails, and you don't know what to do, if you're a married couple, just practice. It's a Super Bowl freebie right there, all right? All right, let's not get it twisted. Right? We need some biblical advice. God designed sex. He designed sex to be powerful, to be pleasurable. It's a point of connection within the marriage. It is a gift that God gives us. And we get to exercise it with freedom. And our hope and desire is that it's something that would draw us together, not something that pushes us apart. Relationships at every level, they're hard. They can be messy. They're complicated. There's a lot of emotion around it. And at times, they're even confusing and maddening. But when it comes to those most important relationships, we want to invest because we don't want to get it twisted. So I encourage you, come back next week because we're going to pick it up as we continue to talk about love, sex, singleness, and dating. Let me pray for us.